Every day, masses of cargo containers arrive in Europe. A growing number come from China.
What's vital for both sides is that trade continues in both directions.
China has a gigantic plan for a global network of ports, roads, railways, and other infrastructures to connect China to the world. This Belt and Road Initiative, dubbed the New Silk Road, has a clear strategy.
Everyone knew this is about brutal self-interest, both economic and geopolitical, and had to accept that.
Recently, the COVID-19 pandemic highlighted the risks inherent in such global trade structures.
I think this should be a lesson to us in terms of dependence on China.
The best place to learn about such dependency is where the New Silk Road is already a reality. We visited 3 cities to see how big China's presence in Europe currently is and how dependent the people affected feel. Our first stop is Duisburg in Germany, home to the biggest inland container port on the planet. Comprising 21 harbors and 130 cranes, last year alone it handled more than 4 million containers. Duisburg is one of the European termini of China's monumental New Silk Road project, which many, including the Port Authority Company, see as a positive development.
We're the hotspot in Europe, by far the most profitable location. It's not as if they chose Duisburg because it's pretty.
Duisburg is a city shaped by the coal and steel industries and by their decline. After struggling to adapt and restructure its economy, the city welcomed the commercial opportunities from becoming a major junction on China's revived Silk Road. President Xi Jinping's first ever state visit to Germany in 2014 included a trip to Duisburg. He welcomed the freight train arriving from China, a symbolic confirmation of Duisburg becoming part of the Silk Road.
I expect to see a significant boost for our operations. The Chinese market is of such paramount importance that our port has to use this opportunity.
The New Silk Road is an undertaking of colossal proportions. It includes 2 railway routes crossing Asia and then Europe, one via Russia, Belarus, and Poland, and another further south taking in Central Asia, Iran, and Turkey. There's also a sea link between China and the Mediterranean via the Indian Ocean and the Suez Canal, and new air freight routes, all designed to increase trade volume between China and Europe. But the Belt and Road Initiative incorporates far more than just trade with Europe. It has already seen the construction of countless bridges, tunnels, railway lines, roads, and ports across Asia and Africa, in most cases built by Chinese firms with Chinese workers. The biggest infrastructure project of the 21st century involves enormous investments that are largely welcomed by the countries in question, while ultimately serving to enhance China's power and influence. The port of Duisburg already had a highly developed infrastructure in place, making it a particularly attractive location for Chinese importers. Around 30 trains a week currently travel back and forth between China and Duisburg. Each journey covers around 11,000 kilometers and takes around 2 weeks. On board are clothes, medicinal products, electronics, automotive parts, and toys. Almost a third of all Chinese goods arriving in Europe by train are offloaded in Duisburg.
Frankly, we initially thought, what a crazy idea, a train from China to Duisburg. But let's let them go ahead. Since then, public awareness has been greater than the economic significance. Of course, the trains, with all these colourful Chinese characters on the containers, look interesting. But to put it into perspective, before the pandemic, we typically had close to 30 trains a week going to and from China, and we do again now.
Over an entire year, that adds up to between 250 and 300,000 standard-sized containers. From Duisburg, they're offloaded for further dispatch via a network of sea and land routes to 92 cities and ports across Europe, or they're sent back to China. A growing number of Chinese companies have now set up business in Duisburg. The company LMAR opened a logistics center here. It capitalizes on the advantages of transportation by rail, which is cheaper than air freight and faster than by ship.
China currently has a very good infrastructure. That means if I want to make a car, for example, a VW or a Tesla, where do I get a missing bolt? I can buy it from one of the factories in the industrial park next door. That's my infrastructure. So in the long term, it's difficult to replace China because they already have the infrastructure in place.
But the New Silk Road project first and foremost serves China's strategy for greater global influence.
Nobody at the port of Duisburg thought this was set up by the Chinese government or Xi Jinping for the benefit of the world. Everyone knew this is about brutal self-interest, both economic and geopolitical, and had to accept that.
For President Xi Jinping, the initiative was part of a long-term plan geared to the milestone year of 2049, the 100th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic.
For the current leadership in Beijing, so Xi Jinping's lineup, the aim is to make China the central global power over the next few decades. And that means, first, keeping the US's economic hegemony in check, and then taking its place.
The objective, say various political analysts, is to establish a new world order in which China is the preeminent power, with various repercussions for Europe.
One of the US's strengths is its network of alliances. Europe plays a major role here due to its economic, technological, and political clout. So what the regime in Beijing wants to do is drive as deep a wedge as possible between the EU and the US.
The Silk Road project could be just such a wedge. For partners, it poses a range of dangers in terms of new dependencies. Exertion of power through trade is the new reality that for a growing number of observers is cause for alarm.
Maintaining trade benefits us and China. But you have to make sure trade doesn't open the door for political power being exercised. Ultimately, it comes down to the liberal values we have and want to defend. And then you have China with its dictatorial surveillance state system, keen to ensure the same in various countries along that route. So as such, that does pose a threat to our way of life.
Our second destination is Genoa, home to one of the oldest and largest ports on the Mediterranean coast. But it's in need of modernization and expansion, while the city's road and rail links are likewise in poor shape. Which is why Chinese investments were a welcome development. Genoa is now also part of the New Silk Road and the center of the Liguria region's cluster of 4 trade ports. PSA, previously called the Port of Singapore Authority, opened an office here. PSA is one of the biggest port terminal operators in the world and a partner of both the New Silk Road and Chinese state-owned shipping company COSCO. Together with COSCO, it's the biggest investor in the regional port operator. The terminal's 5 cranes have the capacity to handle over 500,000 containers a year, but in 2021 shifted only half that amount. Ship traffic has been down due to the pandemic, and then there's the growing size factor. Today's new container ships are up to 400 meters long and can accommodate up to 20,000 containers. Too big to dock here, but there are plans to change that.
This is not a regional port. It's always been international, which will increase further due to these corporations.
Enrico Poggi and his fellow union representatives face a dilemma. The foreign investment is key to securing local jobs at the port, but it comes at a price. Chinese companies have different concepts of speed and efficiency and are keen to take control. It's a question of jobs on the one hand versus workers' rights and conditions on the other. The unions in Genoa are preparing for conflict.
The Chinese came here with their stopwatches. They had their own system that involves permanently monitoring everyone. And that resulted in a serious clash with the union.
This is why we're preparing to defend ourselves if need be, in order to be able to negotiate for the years to come, which will be decisive.
Anxiety over Chinese dominance is growing. People fear an accelerated pace of work, permanent surveillance, and a drop in standards. But ultimately, those fears are often outweighed by the prospect of job losses and financial hardship. Nobody wants to see a port with empty docks.
Working at a port is very demanding, 365 days a year, 24/7. We need a system that guarantees a decent retirement for the one group while also ensuring jobs for the next generation. Because if we can't provide young people with jobs, poverty here will grow.
The PSA logo looms large over the entrance to the new modern Genoa Pra container facility, 20 kilometers west of the old port. Its deep-sea terminals can unload 2 400-meter-long ultra-large container ships at the same time. Singapore-based PSA has strong commercial ties with China. One of the first big changes by the investors was to replace the old Italian crane facilities with gigantic new structures by Shanghai port equipment supplier ZPMC and installed by Chinese workers. But at least, people say, the port is still majority Italian-owned.
Our ports cannot be sold. The most that investors can get is a lease agreement, which has a fixed term. And after that expires, the lease is subject to a new tender process. This prevents Chinese companies from acquiring complete, or at least majority, ownership of a port.
Comunque la maggioritaria quota, diciamo, di proprietà all'interno di un porto.
The lease contracts and other cooperation agreements that consolidate the influence of Chinese investors tend to have a duration of several decades. The Pra terminal has mushroomed over the last few years. 12 megacranes have sprung up here since the first was installed in 2016. For the investors, a port is merely a stepping stone, a gateway to the rest of Europe, and a crucial link in the supply chain to consumers across the continent.
These infrastructure projects often lead to the creation of industrial parks, free trade zones, and trade investment zones, in which European companies, in this case Italian, work with Chinese firms. The aim is to boost imports and exports in both countries.
The headquarters of Hong Kong-based operator Kerry Logistics in Milan. The Italian logistics service provider Tuvia Italia used to be here. But in 2017, its founder, Guido Nazari, sold his majority stake to Kerry Logistics, strengthening China's control over its supply chains.
Our company makes extensive use of the Port of Genoa's services and all of its terminals. The port operators are a vital part of the logistics chain. Unfortunately, Italy suffers from a prevailing infrastructure problem. For us, that means difficulties related to highways, railways, and other transportation routes.
Kerry Logistics claims to be the world's 8th largest freight services provider. It oversees the transportation and storage of all manner of products exported by China, from pharmaceuticals and chemical goods to food, clothing, and electronics. Tuvia Italia founder Guido Nazari made a conscious decision to sell his company to a Chinese firm with global ambitions. He soon saw what it was that the new owners were primarily interested in.
At the time of the takeover, we thought everything would change overnight in terms of both management and the work procedures. But the only real change came in one area: everything connected to cost control, statistics, and the capacity to gather data on our operations, all of which became a priority after the arrival of Kerry Logistics.
The Kerry Logistics network encompasses around 1,000 locations in over 50 countries. The company is mainly active on the online retail front. It sells goods straight from manufacturer to consumer, or to distributors such as Amazon and Alibaba. With no middlemen involved, this means complete control over the supply chain. Stefano Poliani is head of integrated logistics at Kerry's Italian subsidiary.
5 years ago, we didn't have any online operations. Today, this entire section of the warehouse is for e-commerce, and suppliers not just from China but elsewhere in Eastern Asia have played a huge part.
But the Chinese companies are naturally the most important ones, conveying both goods and trade secrets.
This part of the warehouse has 2 areas that are unfortunately off-limits for camera crews. They are where we store material for the 5G devices of 2 major Chinese manufacturers, so filming is not permitted for security reasons. The activities there are very specific and go right up to the assembly of those devices.
Highly sensitive Chinese technology for the 5G telecoms networks of Chinese companies, including assembly. China's strategy of maximum control evidently extends to more than just the supply chain side.
The solution we provide does everything from picking up goods from Chinese suppliers, organizing the containers, and importing the goods to Italy, including customs clearance, plus storage and final delivery. That means customers have a single point of contact and don't have to lose time organizing the supply chain.
Supply chains essentially being 100% Chinese controlled obviously means data transparency for China. They'll know which goods are headed from where to where, which could of course weaken our competitive position. If there's only a handful of suppliers for ports, for rail transportation, or for maritime shipping, then they'll control the prices, to the detriment of our companies.
One end of the Chinese supply chain network comprises Alibaba and subsidiary Taobao, akin to Amazon, eBay, and a bank all in one. According to company figures, it sells 48,000 products per minute and has a market capitalization of $700 billion. Our third destination is the Belgian city of Liège, where Alibaba is building the biggest logistics center in Europe.
I haven't done an in-depth analysis, but Alibaba surely picked Liège because it has a cargo airport with very high capacity that's open 24/7.
Liège proper is the 4th most populous city in Belgium. and the metro area is home to 600,000 people. It used to be called the Fiery City due to the many blast furnaces that once fueled the local economy. But like Duisburg, the city has struggled to recover from the end of coal mining and the almost complete disappearance of the steel industry. In the 2010s, the unemployment rate sometimes exceeded 20%. The hope now is that the cargo airport, with no nighttime restrictions, will change things for good. It's quietly grown to become the 5th largest freight airport in Europe, according to the operator. Here, too, location has been a critical factor. With increased commercial traffic going hand in hand with growth, it's a win-win situation for both Alibaba and the airport.
Alibaba is helping to develop trade with China at Liège and all other airports in Europe. China is a kind of factory for the world and is as such causing an increase in air freight to airports around the continent.
Another location on the New Silk Road that's looking at growth. The airport currently supports 8,700 jobs, and that's set to increase thanks to Alibaba. The facility's management is optimistic about the expansion and Chinese commitment.
Right now, China accounts for 6 or 7% of our business, but it's going to be expanding its warehouses and making Liège the centre of its logistics activities and trade with Europe. So China could soon be making up to 20 to 25% of our business.
But not everyone is happy about these developments. Local activists do not believe the promises of an economic boom.
There was talk of thousands of jobs, but that's since come down to 1,600. We don't have any current information. We want to see a comprehensive study that will enable us to work out the jobs actually created and also the jobs that have been lost. When you promise to resolve the unemployment crisis in the region, you have to create jobs for local people. If they're going to Chinese people, it seems a bad deal.
The airport expects freight traffic to increase. Transportation by air is pricier than by ship or train, but over half of the cargo is perishable goods or needs express delivery, from flowers to live animals, and Alibaba is bringing more e-commerce.
China has been part of the airport's growth. Alibaba's logistics arm, China, arrived 3 or 4 years ago. It opened its first building at the end of 2020, taking up 30,000 square meters of land and adding to the airport's growth.
It remains to be seen how many new jobs the expansion will actually translate into. Critics point to the range of environmental regulations being disregarded in return for the growth promised by Alibaba.
Alibaba's setting up shop in Liège was supported by Belgium, or more precisely by Wallonia. We want to highlight the contradiction here. The government has to take big steps to protect the climate and the health of people living here. We say that's never going to be possible with a project like Alibaba at Liège Airport.
Active opposition to the growing Chinese presence is especially pronounced among the younger generation. The Stop Alibaba campaigners have highlighted their cause by also staging protests at the airport itself.
Over the last 2 or 3 years, we've seen a growing number of complaints from residents living in the area around the airport, especially about nighttime flights. So there's evidently a very substantial NIMBY effect.
NIMBY meaning not in my backyard. But the activists from Stop Alibaba see a far bigger picture. Their opposition stems from what they feel is unchecked and excessive growth from globalization. Alibaba's logistics center will eventually cover an area of 220,000 square meters. The consequences are foreseeable.
There's the impact on people's health from air pollution. Then there's mobility. We have this appalling figure of 1,500 additional trucks on the roads every day. Plus the global consequences for the environment and the climate due to the CO2 emissions from all the planes and trucks.
China is succeeding in its plan to secure locations that together span the entire supply chain. Freight trains now also arrive in Liège, a further branch of the Silk Road.
If the Chinese initiative leads to sound infrastructure in Duisburg and in Liège, and that infrastructure is linked up, it would be commercially advantageous for the entire cross-border region. That could also benefit North Rhine-Westphalia.
However, there's no evidence on the ground to back that up yet. The last few years have provided dramatic examples of the fateful gaps a globally oriented strategy like the New Silk Road has. When sea or land routes are disrupted by a pandemic or a war, supply chains collapse, and the full legacy of global dependencies becomes apparent. Unfortunately, the next crisis of global dimensions could happen sooner rather than later. China's conduct in its conflict with Taiwan has been increasingly aggressive. If Beijing chooses to escalate, the West may be obliged to respond as it has done with Ukraine, possibly leading to an even more worrying fallout.
China has made clear that in the space of 12 hours, it could block off 2/3 of the world's semiconductor production without any military conflict with Taiwan. And there would have to be a response. It would be naive to overlook this and not prepare for that scenario.
But how to prepare? China might be becoming an increasingly complicated trade partner for the West, but it is also an indispensable one. So is there a solution?
I'm in favor of us being more cautious when it comes to sensitive infrastructure. What I'm not in favor of is immediately demonizing all of these investments just because they're from China.
Industry leaders have become more direct and open about the dilemma.
We Europeans have basically no choice but to maintain dialogue with China. In addition to all the products and services coming in from China, we want to access the Chinese market, of course.
So what has our journey taught us? In Duisburg, Genoa, and Liège, the New Silk Road is already firmly in place. The partnership with China promises further and significant growth. But the price to pay is becoming increasingly evident.